The morning sun stretched across Miller's Ridge like honey dripping from a spoon. Thomas Webb stood in the doorway of his grandfather's old barn, coffee cup warming his calloused hands. He had inherited this property 6 months ago, and every day revealed something new about the man who had built it. The barn smelled of aged wood and dust that danced in the light. Thomas had been working on repairs for weeks now, replacing rotted boards and clearing out decades of accumulated memories. Each item he found told a story: rusty tools, faded photographs, newspaper clippings yellow with age. His grandfather, Henry Webb, had been a quiet man, the kind who kept his thoughts close and his past closer. The townspeople of Miller's Ridge spoke of him with respect, but always with a curious distance, as if there were things about Henry Webb they knew better than to ask about. Thomas took a long sip of his coffee and stepped inside. The barn floor creaked under his boots, a familiar sound that had become almost comforting. He had grown up visiting this place, but never really knowing it, never understanding why his grandfather spent so many hours out here, long after the livestock had been sold and the equipment hauled away. Today, Thomas planned to work on the southwestern corner, where several floorboards had become dangerously weak. He knelt down with his crowbar and began prying up the damaged wood. The nails groaned in protest, releasing their grip after 50 years of holding fast. The first board came up easily, then the second. But when he lifted the third, Thomas stopped cold. Beneath the floor, where there should have been only dirt and foundation stones, there was something else. A door. Thomas set down his crowbar and leaned closer. The door was made of heavy wood, darker than the barn floor above it. Iron hinges, thick and old, held it in place, and in the center, an iron lock, crusted with rust, but still intact. His heart began to beat faster. He pulled up more floorboards, working quickly now, until the entire door lay exposed before him. It was perhaps 4 feet square, set into a frame of stone. Around its edges, the wood was sealed with what looked like tar or pitch, as if someone had been very concerned about keeping something in, or perhaps keeping something out. Thomas sat back on his heels and stared at his discovery. Questions flooded his mind. How long had this been here? Why had his grandfather hidden it? And most pressing of all, what was behind it? He pulled out his phone and searched for the number of Evelyn Martinez, the woman who ran the historical society in town. If anyone would know about this, it would be her. Evelyn had lived in Miller's Ridge her entire 78 years, and she remembered everything. She answered on the third ring. "Evelyn, it's Thomas Webb. I found something in the barn. Something strange." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of something, Thomas?" "A door, under the floorboards. It's locked." The silence that followed was longer this time. When Evelyn finally spoke, her voice had changed. It was quieter, more careful. "You found Henry's door. You knew about this?" "Some of us did. The older folks. Your grandfather made us promise never to speak of it. Especially not to you." Thomas felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. "Why not to me?" "Because it was his burden, Thomas. Not yours." He made that very clear. Evelyn sighed, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. "But I suppose secrets don't stay buried forever. Maybe they're not meant to. What's down there, Evelyn?" "I don't know exactly. Henry never told anyone, but I can tell you what people remember, what the old-timers used to say before your grandfather put that door in place." She paused, and Thomas could hear her settling into her chair, preparing for a story. Back in the 1880s, this property belonged to a man named Samuel Thorne. He was a banker, wealthy, respected, but during the financial panic of 1884, his bank failed. People lost everything, their savings, their farms, their futures. Thomas listened, the phone pressed tight against his ear. Samuel couldn't live with what had happened. Some said he'd been involved in some kind of fraud, though nothing was ever proven. One night he disappeared. They found his horse wandering the next morning, but Samuel was gone. Most folks assumed he'd fled west or maybe ended his own life somewhere no one would find him. And my grandfather? Henry bought this property in 1948, when he came back from the war. About a year after he moved in, he started acting different. Wouldn't let anyone in the barn. Spent days out there doing God knows what. Then one Sunday he came to church with fresh concrete dust on his boots and asked Father Michael to come bless the barn. Wouldn't say why. Thomas looked down at the door. Did Father Michael come? He did. And when he came back, he looked pale as winter. But he kept Henry's confidence, same as the rest of us were asked to do. All he would say was that some doors are locked for good reason, and we should respect that. After he ended the call with Evelyn, Thomas sat for a long time beside the door. The rational part of his mind told him to leave it alone, to replace the floorboards and forget he'd ever found it. His grandfather had kept the secret for over 50 years. Who was he to undo that decision? But another part of him, the part that had driven him to restore this barn in the first place, needed to understand, needed to know the full truth about the man who had raised him after his own father had left. Thomas went to his truck and retrieved a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters. The lock was old, and after several minutes of work, it finally gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the barn. He pulled the door open slowly. The hinges screamed despite their coating of oil. A ladder descended into darkness, the rungs worn smooth by use. The air that rose from below was cool and smelled of earth and something else, something like old paper and preservative. Thomas fetched a flashlight from his truck and began to descend. The ladder went down about 12 feet, ending in a small chamber carved from the earth and reinforced with brick walls. The ceiling was low enough that Thomas had to duck his head. The flashlight beam swept across the space, and Thomas drew in a sharp breath. The chamber was lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with ledgers. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their leather spines labeled with dates going back to the 1880s. In the center of the room stood a small table and chair. On the table lay a single book, newer than the others, and beside it, an envelope with Thomas's name written in his grandfather's distinctive hand. Thomas picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside was a letter, dated 3 years before his grandfather's death. "My dear Thomas," it began, "if you're reading this, then you've found what I've kept hidden all these years. I've debated many times whether to tell you about this place, but I could never find the right words. Perhaps it's better this way, letting the discovery speak for itself. When I bought this property, I found these ledgers buried in a trunk beneath the barn. They belong to Samuel Thorne, and they tell a story that the town of Miller's Ridge has forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget. Samuel didn't flee or die. He recorded everything, every transaction, every decision, every person affected by the bank's collapse. And he recorded something else. The bank didn't fail by chance or mismanagement. It was deliberately destroyed by 3 other businessmen who wanted to buy up the foreclosed properties for pennies on the dollar. Samuel found out too late. They threatened him, told him if he spoke up, they'd make sure he hung for it. So he ran. But before he did, he documented everything. I found these ledgers and spent months reading them, verifying what I could. Samuel's records were meticulous, and I realized that if I brought them forward, I would destroy 3 families that had been pillars of this community for generations. Their descendants had no knowledge of what their great-grandfathers had done. They were good people, Thomas. I knew them. Their children were my friends, so I made a choice. I sealed these records away. I took on the burden of knowing so that others wouldn't have to bear the weight of their ancestors' sins. Was it the right choice? I don't know. I've questioned it every day of my life. But once made, I couldn't unmake it. Now the choice is yours. You can bring these ledgers to light. You can restore Samuel Thorne's name and perhaps bring some historical justice to those who suffered. Or you can do what I did. Recognize that the truth, while important, isn't always more valuable than peace. The families involved have all passed now. Their great-great-grandchildren still live here, unaware of this history. I trust you to make the right decision, whatever that may be. I'm sorry to place this burden on you, but I also know you're strong enough to bear it. You always have been. With all my love, Grandfather Henry. Thomas read the letter 3 times. Then he picked up the newer ledger, the one his grandfather had kept. Inside he found page after page of notes. His grandfather had tracked down every person affected by the bank's collapse, every family that lost their farm. He'd researched what happened to them, where they went, how their lives unfolded. Many had rebuilt elsewhere. Some had prospered, others had struggled for years. His grandfather had documented it all, as if bearing witness was its own form of justice. Thomas climbed back up the ladder and sat in the doorway of the barn, watching the sun move across the sky. He thought about his grandfather, a young man returning from war, stumbling onto a secret that would shape the rest of his life. He thought about Samuel Thorne, a man destroyed by forces beyond his control, choosing documentation over vengeance. And he thought about the families in town, people he'd known his whole life, who had no idea their legacies were built on fraud and betrayal generations ago. What good would come from revealing it now? The guilty were long dead. The victims were long dead. Only descendants remained, and they were innocent of everything except the accident of their birth. But wasn't truth worth something on its own? Didn't history matter even when it was painful? Thomas sat there until the sun began to set, painting the barn walls gold and amber. Finally, he made his decision. He climbed back down into the chamber and gathered up all of Samuel Thorne's original ledgers. These he would donate to the Historical Society, but with instructions that they remain sealed for another 50 years. Long enough for all the families involved to pass beyond the reach of judgment, but not so long that history would be forgotten forever. His grandfather's ledger, with all its personal research and agonized notes, Thomas kept for himself. It was a record of his grandfather's character, his struggle with an impossible choice. That was a family history worth preserving. Over the next week, Thomas carefully restored the chamber, reinforcing the walls and installing a proper seal on the door. He replaced the floorboards above it, but left them unmarked and easy to remove. Someday, perhaps, someone else would need to make the same choice. He wouldn't rob them of that opportunity. Evelyn accepted the sealed ledgers without question. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said simply. "I can see that goodness runs in the family." Thomas returned to the barn one last time before finishing his renovations. He stood in the spot where the door lay hidden beneath his feet and spoke to the memory of his grandfather. "I understand now," he said quietly, "why you spent so much time out here. Why you needed this place to think. Some knowledge is heavy. Some choices don't have right answers, only the answer you can live with." The barn was silent except for the soft sound of wind through the rafters. But Thomas felt in that moment that he wasn't alone. That somehow, across the barrier of death, his grandfather heard him and approved. He locked the barn door behind him and walked back to the house through the golden evening light. The secret was safe. The burden was shouldered. And Thomas Webb, like his grandfather before him, would carry it with dignity and grace, trusting that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in revealing the truth, but in knowing when to let the past rest in peace.